All right, good morning, everyone. All right, so a few housekeeping things before we dive in. I just found out that this Thursday is in-service day, which, if you guys don't know, is just a day where faculty have to go to meetings and trainings and stuff. And so I am not allowed to hold class. I'm sorry. So we do not have class this Thursday. And then next week, Tuesday is actually my birthday. So I was wondering if you guys wouldn't mind having 2 half weeks in a row. I don't mind celebrating my birthday with you, but that extra hour would also be lovely. So I will leave it up to you guys. Are you guys cool with 2 half weeks in a row? Thank you, Ava. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I will take that as an early birthday present to myself. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So then, yeah, we are going to go through as much as we can today about death and immortality. And then next week is religious epistemology, which actually, I am sorry to miss 2 days of that with you guys because that was my jam. That's what I wrote my master's thesis on. So, right, this question that we've sort of been hinting at all quarter of, okay, if we maybe can or cannot argue or prove that God exists, can we at least argue that it's rational to believe in God, right? Despite having maybe sufficient evidence for proof, right? Because we believe a lot of things that we don't have 100% certainty of, right? So that's the next sort of step, right, for these philosophers after we've finished up last week the problem of evil, right? Our one argument potentially against God's existence after looking at lots of arguments for God's existence, right? And so a lot of philosophers remain unsatisfied with those sort of debates, right? We left a lot of things sort of hanging up in the air, right? With regards to, how we view the nature of space and time and God's relationship to that and logical possibilities and what we think that God might be like given what we see in the world, right? Lots of different things. So again, given the lack of sort of consensus and the fact that people are still debating whether or not a God exists. Again, it's not something we can definitively prove one way or the other yet. Again, we're going to see the conversation switch next week. And so because of that, you are going to get some, pay attention to the PowerPoint because there's a lot of new vocab words, especially in Latin. Sorry, philosophers love their Latin. So you're going to get fun things like de jure and de facto. So just make sure that we get a handle on some of those new vocab words. But really, the point is what I'm verbally explaining to you in English right now, which is that, right, we're going to see a switch from trying to prove God's existence to just talking about rational belief, right? And so this is why it's called religious epistemology, right? So we're just talking about belief now, justified belief. And so we're going to get to, some fun counter experiments. Like if any of you, oh, this is perfect, Ava, with your noodles. Some people like to go into, okay, well, if it can be rational to believe in God, well, then can I believe in the flying spaghetti monster, right? So we have to have a conversation about the rationality of faith. And you're going to get to see one of my favorite young female philosophers in philosophy of religion. Her name is Lara Buchak. She works at UC Berkeley, or at least she did. She might have switched recently, actually. But she has this really fun paper. I forget if I assigned it. It might just be optional, but I highly recommend it. And it is, she argues that faith is rational in God because faith can be rational in lots of situations, right? And so she uses an argument by analogy, right, which we've seen before in our teleological arguments, to say, like, well, okay, imagine if you're in a romantic relationship, right? And you have faith that your partner is being monogamous, right? As you, in this hypothetical, have agreed upon. Now, imagine someone were to present you with an envelope full of evidence as to whether or not they were cheating on you one way or the other, right? You don't know which way the evidence will lean unless you open the envelope, right? And so her whole point is that if you really have faith in your partner, should you want the evidence? Like, should you want to look in the envelope? So she kind of uses this argument to justify faith in God, right? Why we needn't be searching for evidence if we truly have that faith, right? And of course, we will have that faith for a reason, right? And she's going to give us conditions under when it's rational to have faith, right? And so this is something that some other new terms, I may have mentioned them at the beginning of the quarter, but they're going to come up again next week. And that is the difference between faith and dogma, right? So faith is believing in something despite a lack of evidence, right? So again, we have faith in a lot of things. Like I have faith that my car is still parked out back. I don't currently have evidence of that. I'm not looking at it, right? So I'm taking it on faith that it's still there, right? But that faith is based on other things, right? The fact that I have been here living in this house for a couple weeks now, right? No one has stolen my car in that time, right? Using a little inductive reasoning here, the future will be like the past. Okay, it's very unlikely, right? That all of a sudden there's a car thief in the neighborhood. And my car's more dirty than it was 3 weeks ago, so it's even less enticing than it was right when I first moved in. So again, my faith is not totally baseless, even though I lack evidence to confirm what I have faith in. Does that make sense? Whereas dogma is believing in something despite counter evidence. Okay? So like if I go outside right now and I see no car where my car is supposed to be parked, it would be irrational of me to continue to believe that my car hadn't been stolen, right? Or that at least something was not amiss, right? Because I now have evidence against that fact, right? I currently, in my current state, am sitting here taking it on faith, right? Because I have evidence neither way. But if you continue to believe something despite evidence against it, that is a dogmatic belief, okay? So just know that next week, again, I'm only going to see you on Thursday. Thank you very much. That our philosophers are only going to be arguing that certain types of faith are rational. Okay, so no one's going to be arguing that dogma is rational, right? Dogmatic belief will always be considered irrational, right? For a number of different reasons. Okay, so some terms that you're going to encounter next week, right? Some Latin, and some clarification on exactly what the conversation will be about. Okay, but so this week we are talking about death, the soul, and the afterlife. Super positive stuff, right? Isn't that, because that's what we all need right now, more in our lives, thinking about mortality. But it is perhaps what drives most of us to be philosophical, right? Is this, again, this inevitable end we have as mortal beings. So one thing that we're going to see here this week is a difference between Western and Eastern conceptions, okay? But I just want to clarify that the two Eastern conceptions we're going to talk about, even though they're related, they have different views of the soul, even though they have similar views of the afterlife. So Hinduism and Buddhism are going to be a little bit tricky, but we'll spend some time delineating. Excellent question. So you're absolutely right to ask this question, and I'm going to provide you with some resources in addition to answering it. So there are a couple ways we can understand terms like dualism. They both refer to metaphysical stances, right? So stances on what exists. But you're right in that you could be talking about duality in terms of personal identity, right? So like what makes up who we are, right? So just in the context of personal identity, you could be a dualist. But then there's also a type of dualism about the whole universe, right? Where you could be dualist and you think that in the entire universe, everything is made up of two things, right? There are two realms of existence. And so we actually see both types of those dualisms in Plato. So Plato is a dualist in that big metaphysical sense, as well as in the personal sense, if that makes sense. Awesome. Okay, so with that, I'm going to share with you the first page, which is the mind body. So this is the one, this is the type of dualism relevant to our discussion today, right? Personal identity. And the reason that the question of what makes up who we are is important is because if you're not a dualist, right, then you're usually only committed to the existence of a physical self, right? So that dualism part, that second thing, is the soul, right? It is the the immaterial thing, which then, right, intellectually we infer because it's immaterial, it is also immortal, right? Eternal, because immaterial things aren't subject to the laws of decay like physical entities are. Right. So if you are a dualist in terms of personal identity, you are postulating that there is something about you that exists independently of this physical body. Okay. So that second thing is important. If you are not a dualist about personal identity, then you are what's called a materialist. Okay. Or a physicalist, right? You're only committed to the existence of our physical forms. Now, of course, we can break up our physical forms into lots of different ways, right? And talk about it in different senses, right? So, like Buddhism is going to talk about like the 5 different components of our self, right? All based in the physical. Other people, it actually ends up correlating to the 5 senses a little bit, which is kind of cool, right? So like an early version of that. But right, all these different ideas of how we interact. So in Hinduism, they don't number it; they use it more. They use a metaphor of a chariot, right? So just like we saw in, or sorry, that's not in this class. We didn't talk about the Bhagavad Gita, but there's a very famous narrative in Hinduism about a battle that takes place, and there is a divine chariot driver, and then the chariot, the archer in the back, right? And so it's like this very important story in Hinduism, but that visual is also used to describe how our soul interacts with our body, right? So like each part of the chariot represents a different part of yourself, right? And then different parts of the horses and the road and the chariot itself represent your body, right? It's almost sort of like Plato is going to talk about, right? There has to be some being using the tool, right? The instrument. So if our physical body is the thing with which we interact with the world, there has to be some other thing using the tool, right? The tool itself doesn't have will, right? And so it's a question of where you come in. Are you something more than just the physical stuff that makes up who you are, right? So once all of the neurons stop firing, right, in that gray matter between your ears, right, is there still something else there? It's a big question, right? It's a question that we, again, don't have a clear answer to. The closest thing anyone has ever come to trying to prove that there is a soul, there have been a couple of different attempts, if you're interested, scientific attempts. Some of them are a little more woo-woo-y, like, giving answers to spirits in the afterlife so that they can complete like a crossword puzzle through people, like some really interesting controlled experiments like that. But the more common one, and I actually love that they used this as the basis for a Will Smith movie, I think. It was called like 7 ounces or something like this. But basically there is an
7 pack or
yeah.
something like that.
Okay, yeah. So the whatever the ounces, it's only like the pile of like a few nickels. But basically, when anyone dies, people's body tend to lose almost the same amount of weight. Now, some people think this is just the weight of the oxygen leaving the lungs in the body, right? So as the body contracts, right, upon physical death, right, lots of things are excreted from the body. I won't be graphic, but air is one of them, right? And so we could account for that. But some people think, well, why is it the same amount of weight regardless of the person, right? Because we might think that if people are of different sizes, then the amount of weight that is lost should differ in proportion to the person, right? But everyone seems to lose the same amount of weight. So some people have speculated that this is the weight of the soul, right, leaving the body, which I think is kind of cool, right? So future scientists, we've got some unanswered hypotheses out there for you too. Still needing answers to those things. Right? So the first question that we're going to be dealing with this week is this question of what makes you who you are, right? So you will have to decide, are you a physicalist or are you some type of dualist? Okay. And then if you're a dualist, that's where the question of the afterlife comes in, right? So then what happens to the immaterial part of us, the soul, as it's often called, right? In philosophy, this is a term that's actually can sometimes be confusing. Philosophers will call the soul the mind. Again, I'm sorry, it's confusing. And it's because they want it to attribute the soul, the immaterial part that makes you who you are, with your rational self. Okay, so they don't want to give reason and rationality credit to the brain. So when philosophers talk about the mind, they're not talking about the brain. Okay, they're talking about the soul, the rational part of the self. Right? So like you might think of this again, you could explain this purely in terms of physicalism, right? But like if someone were in a coma, right? And maybe they explain like an out-of-body experience, right? Like how could you have memories of a different perspective other than where your physical body was, right? This would be an explanation of that, right? That memories even, as well as the capacity for reason, are housed in the soul, right? That's immaterial thing. And again, if you want to be charitable to the woo-wooiness, a lot of cognitive psychologists and scientists still today think that consciousness is not like one place in the brain, right? It is like this holistic thing. We don't really have an answer to what consciousness is. Okay, this is why it's questionable as well as to whether or not consciousness could be transferred, right? If it's immaterial, how does it connect to the material? And if it connects, Rene Descartes thought it connected through the pineal gland, right? That's because he didn't know what that was for. So he's like, that's where it is. It's like this little gland in the brain. Like that's where it connects. But if you think there is some interaction, right, between the soul and the body, could that potentially be replicated with other physical mechanisms, right? Like maybe you guys have seen the movie Transcendence with Johnny Depp, and he, when we're talking about uploading consciousness, right, into a computer or something like this, right? What would that all accounts for some sort of action between something immaterial, if you believe in a soul, right, and the material. Now, if you're purely a physicalist, it's an easier picture, right? You're just figuring out how to move matter from one place to another, right? But if you believe in something immaterial, right, that houses those memories, right, there's a little bit more to account for here. And so there's going to be some questions from philosophers as to whether or not we should even believe in something like a soul, right? And some people are going to think of it as separate from memories, right? That's the more common conception that we have, right, of a soul, is something that doesn't necessarily house our memories. And so if that's the case, like, how could you tell one soul from another that's like been reincarnated or that's brand new, right? Like, if every soul is wiped clean, right? Does it make sense to talk about like past lives and things like this, right? So there's lots of questions about knowledge and its relationship to the soul, right? If we posit something immaterial like it. Okay, so you're going to see a lot of different conceptions of that and lots of different arguments for and against these different ideas, right? Reasons why we might think there is something else, something immaterial. Reason why we might think knowledge is housed there. That's definitely Plato's view, right? And so all of that comes from, again, the lack of certainty that we get in the physical world, right? So he thinks that the body is actually constantly getting in the way of knowledge, which I think is, I actually like his account of that, because if any of you have ever gotten like super into a project and you're like, oh, stupid body, I need to eat or go to the bathroom, right? You're like, can you just cooperate? I'm doing things here, right? Like our body has needs. It's constantly interrupting our intellectual goals and things like this, right? So he really does see that duality, right? He really does see them as two competing wills almost, right? And end goals. And so he actually postulates for the self, Plato's conception of the soul has three parts, right? So Plato's not even just a dualist about he is in terms of, mind and body, but there's also technically a third part to Plato's conception of the soul, which is also what humans, animals, and plants have in common, right? So he thinks every living thing has a soul, right? Plants are alive, right? They have what he calls the appetitive part of the soul. This is the part that just is required for living, right? That you require nutrients, right? Certain levels of environment, right? Animals, plants, and humans all have those basic, right, survival needs. So we all have that type of soul. Humans and animals, though, are different from plants, we have another part of our soul, which he calls the spirited part. This is the part that makes us want things beyond just our physical, like survival needs, right? It's the reason why we don't just eat enough to survive, but can be gluttonous, right? It's the reason why we want lots of things that might actually be antithetical to our survival, right? And again, humans and animals are very similar in that regard, right? We will consume things to our detriment. So that's the spirited part of us. It can get a bit unruly. That's something we have in common with the animals. So the thing that sets us apart for Plato is the rational part of the soul. Okay, that is unique to humans, right? And it's this part of the soul that he thinks rules over the other two in philosophers. So this is why he thinks the philosopher king is who should be in charge, because our souls, we have balanced reason with the other parts of our souls, right? Or we have given it the proper control. Now, what's interesting, and this is also relevant for this week, is that Hinduism also has a three-part picture of the soul, very similar to Plato. So the Western version of why this is the case is that Alexander the Great took Plato's philosophy over with him, right, as he made his way east, right? And so the idea is that Plato's teachings merged with Indian theology, right? It's giving a little bit more credit to the Greeks than to the Indian scholars who are actually older, but that's how the the common narrative goes, right? But the Indian conception of the soul is also very important because it is connected to a notion of reincarnation. So we don't have notions of reincarnation in Western metaphysical pictures, okay? The closest thing would be resurrection, right? But that's only supposed to happen once, and it's not supposedly happened yet. So different than reincarnation, which is part of a cycle in Eastern traditions known as samsara. So samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And the notion that a soul transmigrates or moves from one life cycle to the next is called reincarnation. Okay. So here's what's interesting about Hinduism and Buddhism. Both Hinduism and Buddhism maintain the existence of samsara and the doctrine of reincarnation. However, only one of them maintains the existence of a soul. Weird, right? What is being reborn if there is no soul? Does anyone know which religion does not postulate a soul? Hinduism or Buddhism? The Buddhist metaphysical picture maintains a doctrine called anatta, or in Sanskrit, anatman, or not self, okay? So they are pure physicalists, okay? The only thing that exists in terms of our quote-unquote personal identity in Buddhism are what are called the five skandhas, which, like I said, kind of connect to the five senses, okay? It's just the stuff that makes up our physical body from which a notion of consciousness emerges, right? So they even have like a whole model of how our sensory experience produces consciousness. It's quite complex and impressive, right? Given that, they're just going off of experience, right? And an internal reflection. Okay, so they have a doctrine of not self. There is no immortal soul, but yet there's still a notion of samsara and reincarnation. And the trick here is in another concept, karma. Okay, so in the Western pictures, right, we're going to see an afterlife, usually reward or punishment. Okay, so tied to notions of morality, good and evil, right, our actions and our choices. So too in the Eastern traditions, right, there's a system of morality. Okay, and so this is supposedly what rules the cycle of samsara. It's what determines how you will be reborn in the next life, right? These are your karmic, I call them karmic points, right? It's your karmic justice. Okay, so when people talk about earning good karma, They don't always use it correctly because karma does not happen to you in the same lifetime, right? Karma is something that you are dealing with the consequences of your previous, in the Hinduism, your past life's decisions, right? And so that's going to be tied to the caste system and connected to the picture of the soul, right? So definitely use those gig philosophy pages I've provided on Hinduism and Buddhism. There's lots of useful infographics in there, especially comparing the Hindu and Buddhist metaphysical picture. So just know that Buddhism is monistic. They're not ascribing another reality, right? There's nothing like Brahman. There's no soul. So afterlife is just, again, which realm you get reborn into, but you're not really reborn in Buddhism, right? Because there is no you. So instead, we can understand reincarnation in Buddhist religions to really be just a doctrine of cause and effect, right? So when they talk about karma, they're just talking about the effects of your actions in the world, right? So good karma is you putting out good effects in the world, right? Bad karma is you adding to the suffering, right? And contributing in that sense. Okay, so the goal in Hinduism and Buddhism is not just to be reborn in a better life, right? Or just to make things better. The goal is actually to escape the cycle altogether, right? So in both the Western and the Eastern pictures, right, the physical world sort of sucks, right? In the Western conception, it's full of, both of them actually, it's full of illusion. It's constantly tricking us, right? It's full of evil and suffering and things like this, right? So the question then is there a way out of it? And if so, what does that look like? Right? And so it's going to be, of course, through some sort of moral action, right? But what is the intended goal? Is it a heaven or a hell situation, right? Is it reuniting with Brahman, right? Or just being stuck in the cycle? Or is it Buddhism, which is more like they use the analogy of lighting a match, right? So if you want to think of reincarnation in Buddhism, you could think of like one match being used to light the next, right? Nothing actually moves from one match to the other, but it sparks the next life. So we can understand enlightenment in Buddhism as blowing out the match, right? We're just getting rid of our sense of self. And so what's interesting is when we kind of look at all of them, Buddhism's sense of enlightenment is the easiest. I mean, it's tough. It's really difficult. But it's the easiest in the sense that there's nowhere else to go necessarily. Like nirvana is something that you can achieve right here, right now, right? You don't have to wait until physical death. So lots of different interesting pictures, right, of what makes us who we are, right? What constitutes our experience? Are we more than that, than just our physical experiences, right? If so, what does that soul look like, right? Is it an individualistic conception like we're going to see in the Western traditions, right? Like we're going to see from Plato? Or is it a universal self like in Hinduism, right? Because in Hinduism, our soul is all part of the same reality, right? Us thinking that we're actually separate from each other is part of the illusion. Okay. So the physical world, the illusory world, according to Plato, is called the visible realm. In the Eastern traditions, it's called Maya. Okay, same thing though. They're talking about this physical world and the fact that it is constantly tricking us, right? Everything in it is temporary. It's full of suffering because we wish it were permanent, right? So a lot of the Eastern traditions focus on our attachment, right, as the cause of our suffering. In Buddhism specifically, it's our attachment to our sense of self, right? So your sense of ego is the problem, right? Hence the goal to overcome it, right? But lots of different ideas that we're going to be looking at this week. Okay, so we have 20 minutes left of class, so I want to make sure that we have space for questions too. So questions so far, lots of terms. Again, we're looking at Eastern and Western conceptions this week. Questions, questions, questions. I also have recorded lectures on Hinduism and Buddhism. So you can, if you want, just like from start Just, like not me skipping around and, dropping term bombs here and there. You can get the full lectures there too, because yeah, they're very robust systems. Excellent question. Hinduism came first. Hinduism is actually considered by Hindu practitioners to be an eternal tradition. It's seen as so ancient, it does not have an origin. It is maintained that the oldest text, the Vedas, are authorless, that they've always existed. But in secular terms, it just means it's so old we don't know. We don't know who wrote it or when. Yeah, and so what we see again, like with other religions, is that over time, right, different texts become part of the tradition, different emphases are given, different socio-political contextual stuff comes up, right, that ends up, if you know anything about the history of the world, that stuff affects religion, whether we like it or not. Right? And so we see Hinduism evolve over thousands of years and break off into many, many, many different schools. One of those many schools is Buddhism. Right? And so the Buddha actually came from a Hindu family, right? And so his path to nirvana actually goes through the Hindu tradition, right? He tries the many paths purported by Hinduism to achieve what the Hindu tradition calls enlightenment is moksha, right? To be released from samsara and to rejoin Brahman. So he tried all those things, mastered all of them, nothing, no enlightenment. And then he uncovered what he called the middle way. Hello, puppy. And this was meant to be in between extremes, right? And so we get a type of morality from Buddhism known as virtue ethics, right? Everything in moderation, basically. A lot of wisdom in these Eastern traditions. If you want to watch something that will show you the myth of Siddhartha Gautama and how he became the Buddha, there is a movie I'm going to recommend with a huge caveat because Keanu Reeves has like, I don't know what you call it, brown face in it. It's bad casting. It's real bad casting. But the film does a great job in the accuracy of capturing the myth of the Buddha. I have not seen a video description. Maybe there's something animated, but like, right, this is the only live action one that I've seen that is accurate. And the name of the movie is so bad. I think it's called The Little Buddha. So, recommendation with huge, huge, huge asterisks. Yeah. But you can see, again, very accurately depicted not only how he achieves nirvana, but specifically how he realizes that this notion of a soul that's so heavily emphasized in Hinduism, that is actually the source of our suffering, right? And this is maybe a terrible example, but I always think about back when what's it called? Is it not Project Runway? America's Next Top Model? Is that the one with Tyra Banks? Yes, yeah, that one. I always remember like the first couple episodes where, these girls would get like a haircut and someone gets like a super short haircut. And what inevitably always happens? Who's cried from a bad haircut? I've cried from a bad haircut, no judgment, right? It sucks. But the reason it sucks is because we are so attached to our physical bodies, right? Especially for women, right? I'm sure for men too, in terms of like, oh God, if your hairline is receding, right? Like we freak out. Like that's who we are. We identify ourselves with our bodies. It's why, physical insecurities are so important to talk about, right? Because it affects our sense of who we are. So that's the ultimate form of suffering, right? That the Buddha discovered, that this sense of being attached to you, that there is some definition of what that is, that it's permanent and that you have to try to make sure everybody knows who it is and what it is and make sure, right? Like that effort that we put in to try to control who we are and everyone's perception of who we are, right? That is the ultimate source of all of our suffering, right? So again, widely different views you're going to see this week, from arguments that, yes, we absolutely have a soul. It's individualistic, right? And it is eternal and it's tied to truth and knowledge, right? Plato has a very romantic view of death. So if you know anything about Plato's writings, you know that he writes in the form of dialogues, right? So it sort of reads like a little play, but they're meant to be a recounting of conversations that were had between people who supposedly were alive at the time. And so the protagonist of Plato's dialogues is always Socrates, right? So Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates was put to death, right? For, corrupting the youth of Athens, basically being a philosopher, right? Encouraging people to ask questions. But there is this famous dialogue where Socrates has already been tried and they've sentenced him to death. But the night before he's supposed to be given the hemlock, right, to the poison, if you've ever seen that painting of him reaching for the goblet and pointing up, that's him accepting his death sentence, right, with great pride, almost arrogance a little bit, you might say, right? But there's a whole dialogue about the night before he takes the hemlock where his students come to him, his disciples, the people that were being corrupted by those questions. Basically what I'm doing to you now, right? They put him to death for. So he's in prison and they're trying to break him out and he's telling them why he can't flee, why he can't just run away into exile. And he's giving them all these reasons, right? Again, very idealistic, very romanticized. Some of them include things like, well, look, if I run, then it'll be like I'm admitting guilt, right? And he was very, willing to die for the truth. That's very much a position that Plato takes because Socrates literally died, right? Was put to death for this. But the more interesting thing related to this discussion is that he makes that point again about the body always getting in the way of truth and acquiring knowledge. And aren't we all curious about what happens after we die? I mean, who's not curious about that? Isn't there only one way to find out? Like, he's basically like, why would I, like, this is the time it's happening. I'm not forcing it to happen. I'm not, exerting any particular will to try to bring it about, but it's here. Why would I? Like, now's the time. I'm going to find out the answer to my question one way or the other. So, right, as a philosopher, right, he's not even afraid of death, right? And that is the moral for him in that story, that, not only does his reason bring him to the conclusion that a soul exists, but he's going to find out one way or the other whether or not he's right. And death is the only way to do that. So again, very different approaches. Right? Are we attaching ourselves to our sense of individual immortality, right? Or are we taking the other extreme, right? The Buddhist extreme, and you're going to see views in between as well, right? So lots of different possibilities that you'll be faced with today, and lots of different questions, right? So questions from you guys to help you get through Thursday without me. Cece, do you have a question? Did you guys hear that? Unfortunately, it doesn't bode well for you if you were reincarnated as a cat. I'm sorry. Animals lower realm. Yeah, Ava. Sounds right. Although he thought much more of humans, so that couldn't have been him. That is probably a Platonic dialogue, right? Though Plato's or Socrates' character wouldn't have been the one saying that humans were the featherless biped. They would have been the ones proving the counterexample, most likely. Right? Okay. Yeah, right? Like, okay, this is your definition, Socratic method. How do you explain this then? Right? You accept where they're going from and you sort of use that reductio we learned, right? Yes, good. So we talked about the tripartite soul, right? That's going to be one element of it, right? So Plato maintains three parts of the soul and Hindu philosophy maintains three parts of the soul, both maintaining that the rational part is the best, right? It's what sets us apart. The other part is the metaphysical dualism, right? That there is the physical world, that it is an illusion, and then there is a more ultimate reality. Okay, so for Plato, that ultimate reality is called the intelligible realm. And according to him, it's not heaven, right? But it is the state of existence in which things always are and the things that exist never change, right? So the idea is that if we have an immortal soul, this is where it existed prior to being housed in our physical body. And it's where it will return once this physical body dies. And this is important again in its connection with knowledge, right? So for Plato, all knowledge is innate. It's already housed within our souls. And the way he's able to explain that is because our souls used to inhabit the intelligible realm, which is composed of ultimate truths. This is why he thinks that when you learn something, you're not really getting knowledge that you didn't already have. It's like a light bulb, right? There's a reason we have that sort of like internal spark. He thinks that when you are learning something, your soul is actually recollecting it, right? You're just remembering a truth. So again, it's very interesting, very interesting. But both of them maintain an ultimate reality, right? For Plato, it's much more intellectual, right? The intelligible realm. In Hinduism, it ends up becoming deified, right? So it's called Brahman is the ultimate reality. But since Brahman is eternal and everything, we can't like conceptually have a relationship with it. So Brahman ends up then becoming the Trimurti, right? Which are the three main deities, right? Or the three main attributes of Brahman, right? So that's where we get Brahma. That's the part of Brahman that's responsible for creation. Vishnu, who is responsible for sustaining, and then Shiva, who you're probably familiar with, destruction and recreation, right? But then from there, Hinduism is also polytheistic, right? We have hundreds, if not millions, of different Hindu gods. But the idea is that they're all just different names and ways of talking about the one ultimate reality, Brahman. Okay, so for Plato and Hindu metaphysics in that comparison, the intelligible realm is comparable to Brahman in terms of its degree of reality and its connection with knowledge, just like the illusory realm, the visible realm, is like Maya. Good questions. Other questions in our last 6 minutes? Oh, I actually hear a ticking. Someone have like a clock in the background. It's quiet enough to hear it. No. All right. Then the last little bit I'll say, just because it came to me, it's one of my favorite stories that the Buddhists use to explain karma, right? So again, how can, it's one thing to talk about reincarnation. Okay, there's no soul, but you're like causing the spark, the beginning conditions for the next life. But how do you explain karma then, right? Like it's not fair that we are living the karmic justice of it wasn't even us, right? You're saying there is no us prior in a previous life. So whatever consequences I'm dealing with are not my fault, right? It's not the karmic consequences I deserve, like in Hinduism. So, in order to explain this, the Buddhists use this story of monkeys. And there are two monkeys on a beach, and one monkey is just standing on the coast and he's just chucking coconuts out into the waves. And this other monkey is walking along and gets hit by the coconuts. Like, dude, what the heck? Like, why are you hitting me with coconuts? Like, I am just throwing the coconuts. You can move. You walked into them, you can move. This is meant to be a way of understanding how it's both just, but also it's still part of the suffering of Maya, so it's imperfect, right? Like, yeah, you do have to face the consequences of other people's decisions who came before you and that you are not responsible for. Like, that is just an unfortunate reality of the world that we are in, right? So that ripple effect, right? Yeah, you didn't cause the ripple. It might not be, the wave you're dealing with might not be from a stone you threw, but how you choose to respond to that is up to you, right? And so therein lies the opportunity, right, for goodness, right? So it's whether you find that satisfactory or not, right, it's entirely up to you. All right, so I'll hang out for the next few minutes in case there are any remaining questions, but otherwise, I will see you all next Thursday. Thank you again. I will be turning 38. I had to do the math the other day to remember. It's nice that you stop caring at a certain point. All right. Well, yes, if anyone wants to hang out, otherwise, I'll see you all next Thursday.